In 1960, I started this story. I'm just an ordinary woman who married at 18 and washed my husband's clothes as he came home from work at the Chatham Dockyard as a shipwright. I didn't know the powder on Ray's clothes was anything other than dust brought home from his work. I shook his clothes and then just put them in the washing machine. 2009, 48 years later, I find I have mesothelioma and a death sentence. They led me to believe I had 3 months to live. I didn't accept that, and after my pleurodesis at the Guy's Hospital in London, I started several chemo treatments. Cisplatin and a limiter, which is the standard treatment in the UK. This worked for 15 months, and then my tumours started growing again. I was offered a trial at Maidstone, and this clinical trial acts on the tumour's blood vessels, in which I'm afraid didn't work for me, or I had the placebo. So after another 2 sessions of cisplatin and a limiter, I became allergic. It didn't work, but I did have stability again for a while, and then more growth was found in my next scan. What would I like next? My oncologist asked, as there's no trials and no chemo. I'm not used to a doctor having no answers, so I demanded I went up to St Bart's Hospital in London. That Friday I had an appointment where Peter offered me the last place in the Adam trial. But it would mean a biop, and then I might not even be suitable, and several weeks passed only to be told I'm not eligible. He threw me another lifeline by saying use gem-carbo chemotherapy, and I could have that locally. So back to Canterbury, and I was on chemo again until the September. The October scan was bad news. The chemo hadn't worked. A scan every 3 months was showing the growth of 3 millimetres every 3 months. The marker tumour was 17 millimetres. I wasn't happy, so I got right behind and gave my full support to the Saatchi Bill, the Medical Innovations Bill, and worked with Lord Saatchi and the doctors. I was also on the committee when it was launched in the House of Commons. After all my current treatment had failed, I spoke with Professor Dean Fennell, and in 2013 he gave me the advice to go to the Royal Marsden, where they were starting a trial that might suit me. So I asked my oncologist and she referred me. And in April and May of 2013, I'm now on phase 1 trial of immunotherapy. It isn't just for mesothelioma, but 30 other cancers. But the trial MK3475 is a drug called Keytruda, being tested as it blocks the interaction of a substance called PD-L1 and PD inhibitor. Cancer switches off the immune system and the drug switches it back on, so you can fight the cancer cells. When I was first diagnosed with mesothelioma in 2009, I Googled the word, and as I've never heard of the disease, only asbestosis. All the depressing reports and write-ups gave me a shock, as there seemed no hope, so I was surprised when, as journeys to the Royal Marsden and scans of 16 months and 38 infusions have shown a gradual shrinkage of 81%, and some tumours disappeared. Then on my last scan, I didn't need to get a print off. This time, the doctor said there is no active mesothelioma in my lungs. The tumours were there, very small, but there was no active mesothelioma in them. We couldn't take that in. There was a silence, and we just looked at one another. My thoughts on this now is why, and why me? There were about 5 mesothelioma patients that started the trial, but sadly, I'm the only one still to be on it. The others failed, so proving that it isn't a drug for everyone. My bloods are taken every 2 weeks, and my DNA is looked at by Merck, but I haven't had any clearer answers as to why me. The drug has been very kind and with no side effects except very dry skin. The drug is building up a little army that I have to say, I've left this out, that in actual fact, I'm now in remission, and it's a word that we never thought we'd hear for mesothelioma, And I seem to be the only person in the world at the moment on this drug that can say that. And the drug is building up a little army. The drug's built up a little army that remembers that when it sees mesothelioma again, it attacks it. So the effects last a long time and stops any tumours from progressing again. Being honest, the treatment has worked for me, and currently there's no active meso, but there is still a long way to go to getting a cure for this terrible disease. But this is a step in the right direction. And so now there are many more drugs as everyone's rushing to get on the immunotherapy trial. I do remind people that this treatment unfortunately doesn't work for everyone, and the fact is that all the mesothelioma patients that started the trial with me have now passed away. We mustn't give false hope, but we can still give hope. So now I have thrown myself into my work as a patient rep with the NHS and cancer research, even approving new trials as a patient rep. I have my Facebook warriors in UK, and we all got together and we all talk to one another, and I support them, and yes, I can support some of them right through the night as their partners die, but I do stick with them. I also have pushed asbestos awareness by talking. The message of the dangers of ageing asbestos in schools is not getting through to those in a position of responsibility for managing it, meaning that mesothelioma is still killing teachers and risking children's lives. Around 86% of school buildings contain asbestos, according to a 2015 Freedom of Information survey conducted by Asbestos in Schools group. A government steering committee set up by Michael Lees, whose wife died from mesothelioma in 2000 after being exposed to fibres to brown asbestos over the course of many years as a primary school teacher. Schools with the largest amount tend to be those built in the post-war years, 1945 to 1975, when the use of asbestos peaked before completely banned in 2000. Many of these buildings hasn't had the asbestos removed and therefore getting older and older, deteriorating condition, which means it's more likely to have loose fibres. All duty holders in schools are required under the law to have a plan for managing asbestos, including a survey of where the asbestos-containing material is and whether it is safe, or to let it remain in good condition and unlikely to be disturbed, or whether it should be removed. However, according to recent studies and reports on the issue, schools are still not thoroughly following the regulations, even if they have had surveys and management plans to show. In the absence of any nationwide audit done in schools in the UK to show the extent and type and conditions of asbestos, isolated accounts are the only evidence that we have. As such, they are of value. And then we had the Brent case, where a survey was carried out. A Health and Safety Advisor at Brent Council, Jill Reid, was responsible for investigating asbestos in schools in the London Borough of Brent after one of its former pupils, Sarah Jane Bowman, was diagnosed with mesothelioma at just 40 in 2009. The report's remit was to describe how Sarah had been exposed to asbestos as a pupil in Brent between 1974 and 1984. It also looked at whether children were still at risk today. She says that in a union research correlated with investigations in schools from 2004 to 2009. And therefore, after the control of asbestos at work, Regulation 2002 came in, putting advice to identify and manage asbestos into law. It shows there were excessive amounts of hidden, unsafe asbestos that was not even mentioned in the survey. They found it was so bad that when the asbestos removal contractors came, they found that pupils had been at an elevated risk of mesothelioma every day for up to 14 years. Deadly fibres were picked up by the specialists in protecting clothing while mimicking pupils and teachers in everyday actions such as closing doors, closing windows, opening doors, knocking against columns, rubbing against walls, and sitting on windowsills, explains Jill, who is also technical advisor for the Joint Union Asbestos Committee, which protects education workers by raising awareness of asbestos in schools and promoting its improved management. What we found out is, don't believe what you read, because the surveys they were carrying out in schools are not detailed enough to remain anything. And in Brent, they didn't carry out any risk assessments, and new surveys are needed. So we're now going to spend really a lot of money in redoing the surveys, and they just do, because they weren't done to a high enough standard. So this is the fight that I carry on with, and I just want asbestos out of schools. And also, can I say that when we come to these conferences, we're talking to people that are experts and already know it, and those front doors should be open, and we should have the whole world walk in. Let's start talking to the ordinary person, because it's the ordinary person we've got to get through to, because they have it in their schools and they have it in their houses, and they're doing DIY, and the children are being contaminated in that way, let alone the adults. It's the children's young lungs that we've got to start worrying about. So I keep fighting.
I'd like to talk to you today from a different angle. I'd like to talk to you from a carer's perspective. I know that we're talking of asbestos in buildings, but with your indulgence, I would like to walk you down the pathway that asbestos has taken me down. And during such a journey, anybody unlucky enough to have been exposed to asbestos in that journey could very well pay the price. And that price could be becoming a victim suffering from mesothelioma, or the one who becomes a carer for that victim. For me, my story is a little bit more than that. I became the one who carried this disease home and gave it to my wife, and then I became her carer. If you can bear with me a bit, I'd like to tell you just how this came about. I'm aware that here in Amsterdam you have shipyards, so some of you may understand my journey and its dangers. And I need to step back now in time, right back to, God forbid, 1957. I was an 18-year-old shipwright apprentice in the Royal Naval Dockyard at Chatham. And at this time was when I first met Mavis. She was almost 16, and from the moment that we first met, we were inseparable. I would rush out from work at lunchtimes just to snatch a few minutes together. But little did I know then that that action was later the most probable cause that she would contract this deadly disease of mesothelioma. You see, my working day would involve me in constant contact with asbestos. Perhaps I could give you an example of a typical working day for me at that time. If I can just set the scene as to what a major ship refit would look like. It does not fall into the realms of some of you may imagine from films and posh cruise ships or clean naval ships all spick and span with elegant fittings and linos and carpets everywhere. It does, however, resemble the inside of a rusty bin. No fixtures or fittings, no lights, only low wattage lamps strung up all over the place, limited floors and ceilings, and very few bulkheads. Just one great big, rusty, noisy, dirty container. And on starting my day, I'd make my way on board ship, and this meant making my way through a snake bed of miles of hissing, spitting, noisy compressed air pipes strewn haphazardly along the decks. kicking aside the rubbish strewn about everywhere, but unfortunately a lot of that rubbish was asbestos. It had been stripped and dumped and left where it had fallen to be cleared up at some later date. Eventually, arriving at the area that I'd be working on that day, I would hang up my coat on any hook or nail that was available. I'd step into my overalls and start work. Got to fly. When it come to break time or lunch time, this was almost exclusively spent on board ship. We would be trapped inside with the air which was permanently swirled around by the multitude of compressed leaking airlines, creating this cloud of dust of varying density. It would settle on our clothes, in our hair, on our skin. There was no escaping it. When a lunchbox or a sandwich box was open, it would settle on your sandwiches, later to be eaten by us. Because it was so fine it was barely visible. No one ever told us that this was a killer dust. We'd got no masks or protective clothing. It was just all in a day's work. So maybe you can see just how easy it became for me to be the one who gave it to Mavis. This dust was in my hair and on my skin and on my clothes. And we met on those lunch breaks. It was transferred onto her. And when we hugged goodbye on our return to work, she had now inhaled this dust. But as that was not enough, a few years later when we got married, this transfer of dust was compounded because now she was washing my clothes, shaking them before putting them in the tub. She could not escape the dust and the damage was done. As far as we know, we had neither of us any further contact with asbestos beyond those early days of the 1960s. It was not until 49 years later that this killer dust was to rear its ugly head again. In 2009, Mavis was admitted to hospital with breathing problems. And during the weeks that she was a patient, and after lots of tests, cultures were grown, the results came. And the doctor came to her bedside and said, "Our tests show that you have mesothelioma." "What's that?" we asked him. "It's a terminal cancer," he told us. "You've got about 3 months to live, there's no cure, and there's nothing I can give you." Oh, what a gut-busting, mind-blowing statement that was. So now began years of pain, heartache and uncertainty, and 7 years of treatment. It first began with a pleurodesis operation, and next followed 4 different chemo regimes spread over almost 5 years. And each of these offered some respite, some shrinkage, a small hope that the cancer was actually going away. But soon we are told, "Sorry, your tumours are still growing and we've got no more treatment we can give you." Next, Mavis began a drugs trial, but that was cancelled after a few months because it just wasn't working. Next, more research, and months later, after more tests, biopsies were done, she was tested, trying for another trial. But once again, after several more weeks, we were told, "Sorry, you're not eligible." But now, with the news that her tumours were growing and no further treatment was available, once again we get that news: go home and put your affairs in order. We know what that means. And by this time, Mavis was in a bad place. She was reduced to the use of a walking frame, unable to stand or do any physical effort. And on one occasion, whilst we slowly walked across the road to our local shop, she fell flat on her face. Oh my God, my brain went into overdrive. My instant fear was, is this it? And our dog just sat down beside her. And I'm sure he was thinking, "Come on, Mum, get up. This is not the place to go to sleep." But as my mind was racing, a car stopped right beside us, and out jumped two wonderful people. "We're first aiders," they said. "Let us help." And they helped her to her feet, and the lady come out of her house with a chair for her to sit on, because she was badly injured. Her glasses had smashed and embedded deep into her face. She'd got blood everywhere and a black eye. We then had an urgent dash to our nearby emergency clinic. So now began a frantic search for alternative treatments, because our National Health Service had run out of options. But with Mavis's fighting spirit, she found some light at the end of the tunnel and a last chance to grab at life again. In early 2014, after talking with Professor Dean Fennell, more hope was on the horizon. He advised her to talk to the Royal Marsden, which is a specialist cancer hospital, where a trial for mesothelioma was being conducted. And several weeks later, and after even more interviews, more examinations and more tests were completed, we get that long-awaited letter offering her a place on the trial. So now we can take that leap of faith and step into what was probably going to be our last chance, and that was the Keytruda drug trial. Now we had another chance, but this meant we had to endure 2 more years of drugs and uncertainty, and it involved travelling a 130-mile trip to the hospital at 6 a.m. in the morning and a 12-hour-long day, and having this treatment every 14 days for 2 years. Now, after those 2 long, punishing years, that trial's been completed, and the result of this trial, which finished in June of this year, was CR. That means complete response, and that's just a nice way of saying remission, and that's the best news that we had had in 7 years. It's not a cure yet, but it's the next best thing. It's a breathing space. And for now, our future looks brighter, and for just how long, who knows? But she's alive and doing well. It's been a 7-year nightmare journey, but now with all this behind us, we can get on with our lives. A recent follow-up scan a few weeks back on the 7th of this month shows no new growth, no continued mesothelioma. We can't ask for better than that, can we? So for now, I hope one day all buildings, all schools, all hospitals, all workplaces and all countries will at least and at last be free of asbestos. And only then will things change for the better. I thank you for following me on my journey.